Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and the Harvard Classics Lecture. This is Harvard Classics Lecture number 58, Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ. This is a Christian devotional text written in Latin, we think roughly 1418 to 1427. Now, if you haven't been following my earlier lectures for Harvard Classics, I recommend that you go to learnstrong.net, go down that left-hand side and find the folder for Harvard Classics, and at least watch the lecture that precedes this one, lecture number 57, where I've spent some time with St. Augustine's Confessions, especially books 1 through 10, because those are the ones that are provided in this text. Now, obviously the question is always going to be asked, anytime that you put together a collection of any kind of texts, why was this included and that not included, etc., etc.? And so obviously the question is, why Thomas à Kempis's Imitations of Christ? There's a number of views on this. I think one view is this one. Confessions, to put especially these two titles together, Confessions, St. Augustine's Confessions, in many ways tells you what you should want, right? That is to say, love of and for God, right? Imitations of Christ will tell you how to get there. This is a method, if you will, okay? And that's what we mean by it being a devotional text. And I would say this as well, because some readers are turned off by the very fact that Dr. Eliot would have selected a text like Imitations of Christ. And to that degree, I'm going to say something similar to other texts that were kind of maybe religious in their orientation, like Milton's Paradise Lost, that I believe that this is a text which can challenge both the Christian as well as the non-Christian, or even the non-believer or the non-religious. I think that there's a lot of things that we're going to find in this text about, for example, training, self-improvement, that will speak directly maybe to the non-believer or the non-Christian, the non-religious. Just to remind, our learning theories, we're building off of this learning theory of connecting new information to old information. So if there's anything that a study, for example, of the Harvard Classics is doing for us, and I hope there's one or two things, it's that it's challenging us to at least find meaningful information that we can relate to from our own life experiences. In regards to the way we approach reading texts, just to remind, we're always playing the game of the 3 levels of reading. What does the text say? Level 1. What does the text mean? Level 2. Here, 2A, themes, messages. 2B, some kind of rhetorical techniques, not what the writer says, but how the writer says it. And then finally, at level 3, how can I relate to a text like this? And 3A, how can I relate to other texts? And at 3B, how can I relate to myself personally? Now let's do some quick background information for Imitations of Christ. There are some who argue, and I think probably rightfully so, that other than the Bible, this may be the most read Christian text of all time. It was printed, think about this stat, it was printed 745 times before 1650. I mean, think about that. 1600 is the year Shakespeare publishes Hamlet, just to give you a sense of it, right? Early debate, of course, always is going to happen early on about some of these ancient texts, who actually was the author. And Thomas à Kempis is usually decided upon being the author of this text. Kempis, from 1380 to 1471, he was part of the modern devotion movement, which attempted to return religion back to its more spiritual roots. And this text is very much a devotional text. It's a text that was read by the spiritual seeker, usually often priests, monks, who would then come to the text to hear, what do I need to do to find proper religious behavior, okay? Now it's divided into 4 books, right? And we're going to take a look at each one of these. I will say this here in a moment again. Like I've said in any number of these lectures, I wish I could just read this text in its entirety with you. I obviously don't have the time to do that. It is an amazing text on so many different levels. I want to, however, focus on 3 different areas of study for us. The first is the area of what we will call energy conservation or focus. We've sometimes commented, for example, about this notion of monkey mind, the monkey in a cage with the fire underneath the metal cage, and the minute that the fire hits the cage, the monkey starts jumping all over because he's getting burned, and then Enter the bees, the wasps, sting the poor monkey. And this is the notion of what the human mind is often like. We're jumping around all over the place. This text is actually going to speak a lot about energy conservation, focus, that ability to take care of monkey mind by turning the fire off underneath the cage and letting the wasps out of the room so the poor monkey doesn't get stung over and over again. The notion of the power of distractions in any kind of training. Why is it the case, watch this, why is it the case that I will say I'm going to do X, and I start out to do X, and then I find myself no longer doing X? Why is that the case? Training comes to mind immediately. I'm going to get up, I'm going to do this training every morning, I do it for 3 days, then I'm done, then a month later I come back. What made me stop? That kind of distraction question is one that will be addressed powerfully, I think, in this text. Unlike, I would point out, any other text that we've studied, with maybe the possible exception of some parts of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, where he will make some similar kinds of arguments that are going to sound very similar to some of the stuff we're going to pick up on here. The second thing we're going to look at is the distinction, and we've mentioned this before in other lectures, the distinction between will and sustained will. Think about that one for a moment. I'm going to make up my mind to do something, right? But then I don't do it. The difference between will, saying I'm going to do something, believing it's important to do something, and then sustained will. I actually am able to continue to do it day after day, month after month, year after year for the rest of my life. If I know that it's important, well then why not do it? Or as we will say in our study of St. Augustine's Confessions, we said this, the only sin is to forget. Right? That is to say, we miss the mark. That's what really the word sin means. When we have forgotten what it is that we set out, that we told ourselves was important. So if energy conservation matters and will versus sustained will matters, the third one is going to be this notion of a sense of duty. Duty to self, duty to others, the power of sacrifice, the notion that one should leave the world somehow a better place than one found it when one arrived. All of this we will hopefully derive from our study. Let's now turn to Book 1, Admonitions Profitable for the Spiritual is the way that it is outlined. I'm going to do 2 things with each one of these books. I'm going to give you the highlights of what I think to be the most important stuff from the book, and then I'm going to jump into it. I'm going to show you some of my favorite lines. You obviously will have your favorite lines as you're doing your own reading and study, I hope, of this text, right? First of all, withdrawal, renunciation is important. The notion that the outward life is not as important as the inward life. The emphasis here is on the interior life. This renunciation idea is one that's central to any kind of training, if you'll think about it. So, for example, if you're serious about losing weight, you're going to have to give up certain kinds of cuisine offerings. That's part of the gig. Do you get me? So, in other words, this notion, now obviously we're speaking here in very theological terms. I'm going to use this text to speak not just in theological terms, clearly that's what it's intended for, but also to speak in ways that will help students, those of us who are reading this text, who maybe aren't necessarily interested in Christian theology so much. The notion as well of giving up the pride of learning and education, speaking theologically, right? And to live with the simple. Remember what we said about St. Augustine in Confessions, that for a very long time in his life, he didn't want to have anything to do with the Bible because he thought it was beneath him. The translation he was working with in Latin was bad Latin, and he felt like he was somehow smarter or better than that kind of thing. This text is going to say you've got to give up that kind of pride if you're ever going to really advance in your training. That will lead to the next point, and this was a huge one, the importance of humility. The idea that you don't know it all, that you do need sometimes help with learning new things, right? Or learning how to unlearn the things that you've already known. You're going to have to, we're told in this first book as well, learn to accept the world's contempt, their contradictions, their jeering, their laughing, and the like. Another big one, write this one down. We're going to hear a lot in this first book about the importance of solitude, silence. Okay? The idea that there's so many voices always out there in the world. Constantly, voices, that when training begins in earnest, you have to somehow block out a lot of that stuff, the distractions, right? Another one, and this will not surprise us given our study of Confessions, St. Augustine's Confessions, if you're really going to grow forward, you have to learn to meditate on death. You got to learn to live as a pilgrim and to see this experience of this world as being very short-lived. We've said this before in earlier lectures, and we'll say it again. Notice the significant point. You've never met a 200-year-old person. I mean, just let that sink in. You've never met a 200-year-old person. You won't. And here's why. Because you only get to swing at the park for a little bit, and then you got to go bye-bye in the van. They were teaching this to us when we were young. I don't want to go to the van. I want to stay and play at the park. No, that's not the way this works. The way this works is you have to make sure that you enjoy your time at the park, because it is short-lived. Finally, another major observation here is that you got to make a distinction between hope and overconfidence, right? I mean, you got to have a reasoned hope. Think about that in regards to training, and think about that in regards to planning and learning. I'm going to read all of the books in the library, and I'm not a very good reader. How about this? Let's just stick with a couple of books, right? I'm going to read all of the Harvard Classics. Well, maybe let's just read a little bit of the Harvard Classics every day. That notion of hope versus overconfidence, or setting one's goals so high that they're unattainable, unachievable, and then we just give up. Well, let's jump now into the text itself, and I'll give you a few of my favorite passages. I hope that you are finding your own. This one comes from the very beginning in the 3rd chapter. All perfection hath some imperfection joined to it in this life, and all our power of sight is not without some darkness. A lowly knowledge of thyself is a surer way to God than the deep searching of man's learning. Not that learning is to be blamed, nor that the taking account of anything that is good, but a good conscience and a holy life is better than all. Or how about this one from chapter 5? He says it this way: if thou wouldst profit by thy reading, read humbly, simply, honestly, and not desiring to win a character for learning. Ask freely and hear in silence the words of holy men, nor be displeased at the hard sayings of older men than thou, for they are not uttered without cause. Well, we think, at a level 3A observation, we think of Francis Bacon's of studies, read not to contradict or to confute, right? That notion that when you read, make sure you're paying attention to the ways that you read, to actually read humbly, right? How about this one from chapter 20? This is another one that I think speaks well to our ideas of what it means to be good in training. It's better, he says, to be unknown and take heed to oneself than to neglect oneself and work wonders. Or how about this one? A merry going forth bringeth often a sorrowful return, and a merry evening maketh a sad morning. So doth all carnal joy begin pleasantly, but in the end it gnaweth away and destroyeth. We think, of course, of some of those lines from St. Augustine's Confessions, especially his addiction especially to sexual lust, and the ways in which he said it was just constantly eating at him all the time, right? We'll jump now to chapter 21, and a brief line there. Busy not thyself with the affairs of others. I mean, how many of us would have, we would have saved so much energy if we would just hear what it is that's being said here. Busy not thyself with the affairs of others, nor entangle thyself with the business of great men. Keep always thine eye upon thyself, first of all, and give advice to thyself specially before all thy dearest friends. Before you can help other people, you have to help and take care of yourself. It is the high watermark of hypocrisy in all forms of life when someone is ready to hand out advice that he or she cannot follow or will not follow his or herself. I mean, it's a compelling idea. How about this one in chapter 23? It said this way: what doth it profit to live long when we amend so little? Long life doth not always amend, but often the more increaseth guilt. Oh, that we might spend a single day in this world as it ought to be spent. I mean, what an amazing line. I mean, you can read an entire volume and find one line like that. Put it on a piece of paper. Put it up on your wall and look at it for a few days. Look at it again. Listen to it again. Oh, that we might spend a single day in this world as it ought to be spent. I mean, what a brilliant insight that is. The great Nietzsche said this, right? Live your day as if it's the only day you have. Turn it into a work of art, and then you will know that you've done something well. To live a single day the way it ought to be spent. Powerful. Also from chapter 23, this one. Who will remember thee after thy death? And who will entreat for thee? Work now, O dearly beloved. Work all that thou canst. For thou knowest not when thou shalt die, nor what shall happen unto thee after death. Sounding very much like the biblical book of Ecclesiastes. This notion of it's time to go to work. What better time than to start now to begin to put together this thing called your life. What a challenge that one is. How about this one from Book 1, chapter 25? It said this way. Remember always thine end. This notion of begin with the end in sight. Remember always thine end, and how the time which is lost returneth not. Without care and diligence thou shalt never get virtue. Sounding very much like the classic text, Sun Tzu's Art of War. Always begin with the end in mind, and then you will be able to achieve greatness in your training and in your life. Well, that's book number 1. Let's now turn to book number 2, Admonitions Concerning the Inner Life. And a couple of observations here. Humility, right, is so important and emphasized in this one. God protects and will defend the one who is humble, right? The key obstacle is mentioned in this one to spiritual life. A false sense of freedom, an overconfidence, a pride, we would say. The notion that one should attribute all good things to God is mentioned often and repeatedly in book 2. No gift is unimportant or small when given by God. The idea that whatever it is that you have, use what you have to the best of your ability. And in the last chapter 12, the Royal Road of the Cross it's called, we'll learn that it's all about your attitude. In many ways, I mean, one of the key, probably, if I had to pick one word that's probably more often repeated in this text, it is the word learn. It is the word learn. Life is about learning. And to that degree, it's all about the attitude that you have. Oh, if we could find that attitude of learning. That famous story, of course, about that student who is held under the water and begging for air. And then the master teacher says, when you want knowledge, when you want wisdom as much as you wanted air, then you'll begin to grow. Well, let's turn now to chapter 1 of book 2 and hear a couple of my favorite lines anyway. A man is hindered and distracted insofar as he is moved by outward things. We think of T.S. Eliot's classic line from Four Quartets, distracted from distractions by distractions. Right? Funky mind. We're all, of course, cursed with it, aren't we? Yes. Chapter 3, how about this one? Therefore be zealous first over thyself, and then mayest thou righteously be zealous concerning thy neighbor. If there's anything that I think is compelling in this idea of the distinction between being religious and being spiritual, it's often drawn. Of course, it's sometimes a dubious distinction at best. But let's go ahead and say it. How many religious people often are so interested in saving you, and they never, ever give any real sense of themselves? Or, for example, people who love to talk about training to you about what you should be doing in your training, but they themselves never actually engage in their own training. How about this one from chapter 4? He says, by 2 wings is man lifted above earthly things, even by simplicity and purity. Sounding very much like Henry David Thoreau's Walden. Simplicity ought to be in the intention, purity in the affection. Simplicity reacheth towards God. Purity apprehendeth him and tasteth him. From chapter 5, how about this one? The spiritually minded man putteth care of himself before all cares, and he who diligently attendeth to himself easily keepeth silence concerning others. And then to continue, thou wilt never be spiritually minded and godly unless thou art silent concerning other men's matters, and take full heed to thyself. If thou wouldst have peace and true unity, thou must put aside all other things and gaze only upon thyself. Now, of course, let's point out that when we're talking about this self, we're not talking about this ego-driven self. We're talking, of course, about the self that is that eternal self, the self of soul, the self of spirit. Go back to our lecture on Plato's Phaedo in the Harvard Classics to hear more of an explication on that idea, right? Okay, how about from chapter 6? This one, it is the token of a humble spirit always to do well and to set little by oneself. Always work well, but work with joy in your heart never expecting a reward. Remember those lines we quoted from the Bhagavad Gita? You have the right to work, but for the work's sake only. You have no right to the fruits of your labor. Desire for the fruits must never be your motive in working. Never give way to laziness either, right? And by the way, the Bhagavad Gita and Imitations of Christ sit side by side brilliantly, which is why the great Christian monk Thomas Merton would say it later in his life, that when he came to some of the Hindu and Buddhist texts, he was blown away by so many of the ideas that are repeated in the classic Christian texts that he knew, especially, of course, Imitations of Christ, right? Okay, let's go to chapter 10, and I've got a passage there. Chapter 10, the opening lines of gratitude for the grace of God. Why seekest thou rest when thou art born to labor? Prepare thyself for patience more than for comforts, and for bearing the cross more than for joy. Wow, this sounds very much like what we read in Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, right? That idea of, well, you are made for work. Why sit down? One of the most important things we can learn in our study of the Harvard Classics is there is no retirement. There is no retirement. There is no ceasing from work. Our life is our work. Now, the job that we do, we might change. We might end and go to a different job. There is no retirement. There is no ending on that count. Death itself is not a retirement. Interesting idea. Let's go to chapter 12 and to finish this book, and here a few readings here. Prepare thyself. This is huge in this text. Always about preparing. Prepare thyself for the bearing many adversaries and manifold troubles in this wretched life. You know that they're coming, in other words. How about this one? If thou settest thyself to that thou oughtest, namely to suffer and to die, it shall soon go better with thee, and thou shalt find peace. Our ability to relate well to this notion that we don't get to swing at the park forever. That is central to the kind of life that we get to live, right? Of course, we think immediately of Socrates as a classic example of this, as well as, of course, Christ, no question. For all men commend patience, although few will be willing to practice it. We think of Longfellow's Psalm of Life, the final lines, let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor.